Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I did plan for 20 minutes, but I will follow the instructions of the chairman. So simply my presentation to you this afternoon is on harnessing the energy potential for East Africa for economic and social transformation. My name is Derek Hudson. I'm president of BG East Africa. I have been with BG for quite a long time, for about 19 years, and have worked, run BG's businesses in the UK, Trinidad and Tobago, where I come from, and now in East Africa. This slide is simply to say to you that if I impress you so much with what I have to say, and you buy shares in BG Group, that you can't hold me accountable if you lose your money. I think it will be important, we always do this within international corporations, to say a bit about safety, and the safety moment for today is on malaria. Since being in East Africa, I've been there now about a year, that we have focused on working with, I'm based in Dar es Salaam, by the way, though I cover, as you'll see later on, Kenya, Madagascar, Mozambique, and also any other interests we will be looking at in sub-Saharan Africa. But we have taken an initiative of looking at malaria-safe situations within Tanzania, and we are going to open an office shortly in Kenya, and we'll be doing the same there. So I do encourage others to follow suit. This afternoon, we'll look at our role in East Africa, what is an opportunity for East Africa in terms of its gas discoveries recently, and what that could do for the transformation of East African economies, the impacts of that, and I will use the Tanzanian example, and some words on human capacity development, and has been well outlined this morning, the roles of universities and academic institutions in driving state. These are countries of current operations across the globe. We are in the top 15 companies in the UK. As I mentioned before, I have worked in the UK, the US, Trinidad and Tobago, where I come from, and now in East Africa. I cover there the East African region, which is now a very important hub to that. But you see, we operate in more than 20 countries worldwide. In East Africa itself, it's a relatively unexplored frontier. And one of the interesting things about gas discoveries now that's happening across Mozambique, Tanzania, and most likely soon to be Kenya, and in other parts of the world, it is, for all intents and purposes, being a geologist by training, though I haven't done any real geology for about the last 10 to 12 years, as I spend more time chasing capital for doing various things, that really it is about the most exciting frontier for new hydrocarbon provinces across the world. We have been encouraged to come and participate in sub-Saharan Africa, as in recent times most of the governments are relatively stable and progressive. An important point to note is where East Africa is located with respect to its position to East African, Asian and Pacific LNG markets. And despite some of the problems that you may read about recently with respect to growth developments in China and in other parts of Asia, we are of the firm view within our corporation that global gas demand will outstrip supply and will continue to do so in the upcoming decade. As I say, it's a new exploration hotspot. It is likely to underpin the next wave of LNG developments, spurred on, sadly, by the tsunami effects in Japan, which has meant that the building of new nuclear power plants will probably diminish as we go forward in the future. And gas is definitely the sort of fuel of choice when going forward, because it is so clean. As you see there, we have a strong acreage position. Right now we are in Madagascar, Kenya, and Tanzania, and hoping to expand shortly. In Tanzania, we have up to 13 trillion cubic feet of gas, and that is a lot of gas. Without sort of getting into some of the technical details, in Trinidad and Tobago, we developed 4 LNG plants there. We have 9 ammonia plants and 10 methanol plants. And when I started to do that job back in the late 90s, before moving on to the UK, Trinidad had about 25 trillion cubic feet of gas. Combined between Mozambique and Tanzania, there's more than 120 trillion cubic feet of gas. So there's a lot of opportunity for the East African nations. We have about 13 trillion of it at present with our partner, Ophir, and we hope in the next year or so to continue to build on that as we move this project forward. This is where it is relative to markets. Sorry, let me just go back one. As you can see there, it is well located in respect to the West Coast Indian markets, well located with respect to the Asian markets, and we are right now building 2 LNG plants in Australia, and we will very easily continue to invest in East Africa once the conditions are right with respect to doing so, because as I said before, we think the market is opportune for doing this. Just a point of note, these things are not inexpensive. We have spent to date about $1.5 million US gross offshore Tanzania in doing this work. We're getting ready to spend $200 million US to drill our first well in Kenya. And once this project goes forward, the investment on it will be upwards of about $30 million US. It does not come in a very short time frame, these gas developments. It's not like oil. So in oil, once you have a discovery and you're fortunate, you can turn it into monetary returns in about 3 to 4 years. These sorts of gas discoveries in very deep water usually take about 8 to 10 years before we can bring it on stream. It's an interesting conversation that we have now with the government and people of Tanzania, because with elections in 2015 and then followed in 2020, and of course, political objectives are always more shorter term than corporate objectives. It'll be interesting to see how this pans out, because the returns to East Africa will not be until the next decade. Where does that mean, however, for the socio-economic development, not only of Tanzania, but how it impacts on other East African countries? There's been significant economic progress in East African countries in recent years, and all of you all could sort of lecture me as to the growth rates and what that means for economic transformation. The fact is that at present, when compared to other countries, there's fairly modest levels of human development, and I won't go through all the rankings. The development of LNG projects, and I would say, of course, that I am subjective because that's what I get paid to do, but it does have the potential to transform economies, because the revenues of that predicted just for Tanzania, when it starts in 2020, represents anywhere between 70 to 80% of the donor aid that it receives today in revenue. Okay? Those benefits will come from FDI, government revenue, of course, contribution to GDP and employment, and indirect benefits, of course, again, employment, the multiplier effect on the industry, and capability enhancements. Jobs, of course, are very critical in doing this. There are going to be hundreds of jobs in the planning stage, thousands during construction, and in the operation phase, there are going to be hundreds of direct jobs and a lot of others going forward. And of course, the chance here is that you do not want to continue to import people like myself to do it, because you want to make sure that Africans do it. In Trinidad and Tobago, where I come from, I was very proud of the fact that over the last couple of years before I moved to East Africa, that there were Trinidadians running BP, BHP, and BG, my company, and running many of the methanol and ammonia companies. However, Trinidad has over 100 years history of the energy industry. The challenge for East African and other sub-Saharan African countries that are endowed with energy resources is to see how they can fast forward that objective of getting Africans to run their business. In building human capital, and I've been given my 2-minute warning, so I will move through this very quickly. Chairman, I must admit you're totally unfair given what transpired this morning, but I I do, as you see, I would speak my mind from time to time. But the whole question, and I'll actually sum it up now, what I was going to go through there very carefully is what role we have played in building human capital. The challenge using the Tanzanian example, where you could see the rate of, in order just to reach middle income country status, where you have to go where there's the number of professionals today in medium jobs, and how fast forward it has to move. We do a lot of work today in giving out scholarships, working with universities there in Tanzania and Kenya, and also will continue to build capacity, vocational training and all of that. Frankly, we are about 10 to 15 years behind the curve, and I always apologize to whoever I meet, regardless of how much we do, we will not be doing enough. I think the role of universities, in fact, it is very straightforward. I've heard over and over again this morning what it is that is planned to be done. The challenge here is to stop planning and start doing. Because effectively, if you don't do, then you will not be in a place to harness the returns from the resources which are rightfully yours. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Despite very firm, I think you have done very well. Congratulations. Next speaker is Professor Greg Anderson. Is he present? Thank you, sir.
Somebody give me a haraka. Anybody?
Okay, thank you, Professor McGowan. I also prepared a 20-minute talk, but I'm sure I'll be kept to time, so I'll skip over a few slides. I'd like to thank the organisers for giving me the chance to come here and visit you, and particularly Dr. Boateng for probably thinking of her time in Australia and invited me here. So in my 10 minutes, I'm going to talk very briefly about scientific research and funding in Australia and some of the linkages we have with Africa. So Australia does very well compared to its size in terms of R&D spending. We're only, in terms of population, 52nd largest country in the world, but we consistently rank in the top 10 to 15 in terms of R&D expenditure. In virtually all measures of output, publications, patents, all those sorts of things, we consistently do that. So we perform very well for our size, and I think there's perhaps some lessons to be learned there for other countries of similar size. Funding in Australia predominantly comes from funding for research, I should say. Australia comes predominantly from government. There are organisations like the CSIRO, which is very well known, a range of other government organisations. It's these two on the bottom, the Australian Research Council and National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, that provide most of the basic research funding and also applied research funding in Australia. So I'll say a little bit more about those. The Australian Research Council is basically the equivalent of the National Science Foundation in the US. It supports a whole range of fundamental and applied research and people funding, but it doesn't support its health research. That's what the NHMRC does. There's a whole range of programs for supporting basic research, discovery programs, important linkage programs that join scientists with industry, government and community organisations as well, and a whole range of people support schemes. That scheme is funded to, at the moment, to about $1 billion a year, just under $1 billion, and results for the next round of grants will come out in a few days, so there's some nervous people at the moment. But last year, just over 13 to 1400, around 13 to 1400 grants were awarded. So the ARC actively excludes medical research, and that's where the NHMRC, or the equivalent of the NIH in the US, comes in. So it supports a similar range of schemes, but really devoted towards human health and well-being. I'm not going to go through the details here, but the budget is a little bit smaller, about $750 million, and funds about 1,000 grants or so in each round. So that's a very important series of funding organisations, and the NHMRC, particularly for my institute, which is a medical research institute, gets most of its money from that organisation. The system gets reviewed about every 10 years, and the new report that was released this year. The bottom line of this is that more money needs to go into the system. Even though we do very well by world standards, we'd like to see more money. There are a whole series of recommendations coming out of that report, some of which are shown on the left there. Many of these relate to increasing translation, building capacity, etc., and they're all very important and should be funded. But this report also said that those schemes shouldn't be supported at the expense of basic research. You need to expand those, but you also need to keep your basic research, your blue sky research, referred to this morning, very strong. Collaboration. Science is a global enterprise. These figures taken from a Royal Society report a couple of years ago showed that collaboration across the world is increasing, and the impact of papers coming from that collaboration is increasing as well. So there's a benefit in collaborating. So we live in a very collaborative society. From the same publication, there's a series of networks showing about 15 years ago and about 5 years ago the collaborative networks between various organised in various countries around the world based on publications. And you can see here that on the right, the increased density of collaborations over time relative to 15 years ago. The real powerhouses there, the US and various European countries like Germany are still there, but you're starting to see other players emerging like Australia on that panel on the right as well. I'm sure if we did that today, we'd also see China in that mix. A similar exercise has been done for Africa, and you can see that over that 10-year period or so, there's been an enormous increase in the collaborative links within Africa, and that's extremely important for the growth of science and technology in this continent. Sort out the links between Australia and Africa. There was a 2010 MOU between the African Union and the Australian government that advocated increased cooperation in a whole range of areas that were listed there. Strong links in mining and agriculture, which underlie both the Australian economy and many of the African country economies already exist, and they're continuing. And Australian development assistance to Africa has increased several-fold in the last 5 years. There's a whole range of contemporary technologies that were planned to receive increased funding over that time, and South Africa has for a long time and continues to remain the largest scientific collaborator with Australia in the square kilometre array was mentioned as part of that this morning. There are official agreements between Australia and South Africa. So even though there's been quite a lot of collaboration, overall, considering our place in the world stage and being quite an affluent country, our collaborations with Africa are really quite limited. There's a whole range of organisations that are listed there that point to groups that say they do collaboration with Africa, and some of those have very strong collaborations. The last one there, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, is a major one, for example. But others, the collaboration is only quite limited, so there's certainly a lot of scope for improving that. Just to go over those examples. Education has already been mentioned in a major way this morning, and Australia's second largest export is education. It's worth about $15 billion a year to Australia. We have a lot of high-quality tertiary institutions and secondary institutions, and it's a very popular country for further study. There's certainly been a strong focus on Asia because of our geography, but in figures at least a couple of years ago, there are about 13,000 African students studying in Australian secondary and tertiary institutions. I don't know the numbers on how many of those return to Africa. I suspect most of them would have done. And the Australian government is still offering about 1,000 scholarships a year to African students. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about communications in this meeting. Communications have really changed the way, improved communications have really changed the way science is conducted all around the world, and Africa and Australia are no exceptions to that. And we really need to embrace those changes because they've made a big impact and continue to make a big impact. Collaborations are still driven largely at the grassroots level by individual researchers. Before I finish, I'll get time to give you one example that's worked very well at our institute. But you need both top-down and bottom-up approaches to address particular issues. And the top-down approaches work particularly well for large global issues. But science, as I said, is very collaborative, and the increase in communication has meant that people can access the best research they need to do their work, no matter where that is in the world. I was just going to show a series of graphs there, which, amongst other things, highlighted the major increase or influence of China that's emerged in the last few years. And really just to illustrate the point that if you looked at those graphs, similar graphs 10, 15 years ago, China was nowhere to be seen. So there certainly is a lot of opportunity for Africa there as well. So I've been given the 2-minute warnings as a basketball coach. Just briefly, where I work, Queensland, QI and our Burkhart Medical Research Institute is one of the largest medical research institutes in Australia. And I was going to say something about it, but I'm not going to do that, other than give you one example of one of our researchers. It's Don McManus. Now, Don works on schistosomiasis, a problem through a lot of the tropical world. He works mainly in Asia, has done some work in Africa. But Don has worked in China for 25 to 30 years. He started working in China when its scientific infrastructure and capacity was much less than it is today. But he built up personal links, which became national links, and the people he worked with, those ones have gone on to be people of influence in China. And he's had a very successful program that started with basic research, has had major health impacts, public health impacts, and is a very good example of how research can be conducted. And an important thing about this, when there was discussions about the brain drain and people not returning to Africa this morning, is that most of the Chinese scientists that work with Don have returned to China, and they're based in China, but they still visit his lab regularly. And there's a back and forwards collaboration that's very active, very successful, and I think not just being isolationist and having those sort of links are very important. So just to summarise, Australian-African links remain quite limited. There are strong exceptions, particularly in agriculture. Realistically, Australia has done very well scientifically. We don't have the enormous budgets of the US or European Union, but we still can make a contribution, and we can provide some expertise in a wide range of areas that's relevant to many African countries. And maybe I'll just finish by showing you this figure, which I like from a review of health and medical research in Australia, which really shows the network of relationships that need to be developed when you're addressing all sorts of problems, in this case health. And it needs a combination of leadership, excellence in what you do, research in this case, the capability to do that, the appropriate processes, government processes, ethical processes, all sorts of things like that, regulatory processes, and of course necessary investment. And they all work together to make us move forward. And collaborations like this will strengthen all components of the system and lead to better interactions between Australia, Africa, and many countries. Thank you.
The next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Professor Esiawa. And we give a clap to that.
one needs to understand the meanings of these concepts. Everybody knows that engineering is the application of scientific, economic, social, and practical knowledge in order to design. But when the engineer has designed, somebody must take the design and construct it, and that brings on board technology. Innovation is just doing things new, but in our case, we must do things in such a way that it will be sustainable. The technologies implement a technology in the field of engineering, and I want to say that these are the qualities that we expect from our engineers. They must pay meticulous attention to duty, and they must have great analytical skills, constantly thinking of how to make things better. They are creative and therefore innovative. They are logically inclined and mathematically inclined. They have good problem-solving skills. They are constantly called to solve problems, and they can do it easy. According to Maurice Strong, the Secretary General of the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment, said sustainable development cannot be achieved without the full participation of engineers. And we need engineers to solve Africa's problems. Now, when I looked at the programs we will be running, manufacturing was what came into mind. The quality of services provision for communities needs to be improved upon in Africa. And we need to acquire the skills to manufacture. The lack of attention to this manufacturing capacity building in our educational curricula is the reason for high unemployment among the youth, and calls for measures such as vocational skills development, continuous educational development in engineering and technology, such as intelligent automation, continuous manufacturing and crystallization, photonics, ultra-precision, and nanotechnology. Moving ideas to manufacturing and to market lacks in Africa. The proposal of applications lab, by encouraging students with innovative ideas to practically develop products and finally patent, prototype, and commercialize and market them, is urgently needed. Building a sustainable, innovative system requires critical and analytical thinking, identification of problems, and then doing research to find solutions, and then upscaling the solutions. The applications laboratory I'm talking about should work in conjunction with industries, universities, and governments. In fact, many ideas lie on shelves idle. Can we as a continent search for these ideas and make them prototype for upscaling? We have done a lot of research since the African scientists and engineers. And in fact, during the break, one of the participants said this to me. Some address our needs and concerns and can be utilized. The research institutions in Africa should be tasked to unearth some of these innovative ideas for prototyping and commercialization. Africa exports most of its raw materials to the West and Asia. Value is added in these countries to create jobs in those countries and exported back to Africa. African institutions of higher learning must embark on manufacturing programs. University doing manufacturing programs are few. Skilled labor are required to develop. How can manufacturing be done with unskilled labor? According to the UNESCO report, if you look at the engineers for the developed world, there are 20 to 50 engineers per 1,000 people in the developed world. In the developing world, 5 engineers to about 10,000 people. But in Africa, in some African countries, it's less than 1 in 10,000. We see that China has developed so quickly, because if you take the ratio of engineers to the people in the society, there are so many people who are skilled already, and it's very easy to use such people. Manufacturing means jobs, and jobs means economic stability. Engineering, maths, and science are the basis for manufacturing, and training infants and children to admire a passion for the subject is very critical. The cartoons, the games, and the books that we write should focus on technology so that our children will learn to understand science. Now that I have been shown my 2 minutes, I would like to come on to the case study in my university. We have linked up with a firm to manufacture solar panels for our renewable energy engineering students, electrical and electronic engineering, and mechanical engineering. And the factory will be completed in the next 8 months. The students will do their practicals in this factory. We also have forest that we have acquired, full training stations, where we take our students to the place. We are also recommending a BSc PhD progression, locally trained, that they do not go out. I wonder where and why our students go out and never come back when we can actually develop them. Policies should therefore be put in place to direct human resource development towards engineering and science. African leaders should be made accountable for their actions, and we should also challenge our scientists to deliver. Good moral upbringing should be encouraged so that we will instill discipline and integrity in the youth. We need, as a continent, to do what we are supposed to do and not what the people want to do. Too much business programs will not help us. Let's encourage the youth to do science and technology. God bless Africa and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Professor. The last person is none other than Dr. Lydia Brito. You are most welcome. And please follow the footsteps of your ancestors.
Thank you, Chair. I will try to get presentation as fast as possible. Contextual issues related to Africa in terms of realities and challenges has been set as the new reach that the continent is getting, but also the fact that we have a young population and that we have really a place that we can, a potential of a place that we can take in the world, but that the reality is that we are still a very poor continent. And we are a very poor continent with potential to change, and in a world that is really not the easiest to tackle. And therefore, it's important that we look to a paradigm shift that can support African governments and African institutions to really take the most. And in the case of UNESCO, and that's what we do when we collaborate and partner with African countries and institutions, is really to support countries in the science policy arena, trying to bring sustainability as an imperative, but also as a challenge and an opportunity for transforming not only science, and I will talk a little bit about that, but also society. And also trying to create a process, a science policy as a process that is involving, demanding, and that really brings participation and a multi-stakeholder dialogue And I think the Honourable Minister of Ethiopia today mentioned about that. So what kind of knowledge production do we need for sustainable development? I think again some of the challenges that we are facing at the planetary level have been discussed today. And really what we are looking for is knowledge production that is responding to development challenges. And therefore it changes the nature in the sense that it's much more integrative, multidisciplinary, and even transdisciplinary. And that does bring a new paradigm in science, what we call sustainability science, or science for sustainable development, that is really growing worldwide. But when we look to the distribution of this this new approach to knowledge production, we see that the African continent is still behind in relation to others, and that, of course, is a big concern. So there are, again, key issues and constraints that have been mentioned this morning by our speaker, but based on that, then UNESCO has defined a strategy, and one is clearly related to governance of science and technology at national level, and again, the issue of participatory processes. Also, the issue of building human capital that is very central to this conference. Strengthening research and scientific institutions, the issue of cooperation, and we just heard one of our speakers from Australia talking about the importance of cooperation and South-South cooperation, making quite a lot of issues. And again, this issue of indicators, statistics, and databases that was mentioned. And I will concentrate in this last one, because we believe that it's all about a sound science, technology, and innovation policy frameworks, and you have to have the cycle, and we have to have systems to monitor that. And we also believe that the kind of policies that can indeed drive sustainable development, they have to be seen as transversal and structural policies, not only top-down policies, but really policies that create the building blocks for other sectorial policies in the country, in the region, by supplying the right knowledge, the right human capital, the social contract with society, and the innovation that is needed. But also not forgetting the implementation mechanisms. Again, today our keynote speaker showed a lot of documents, but many of them are not being implemented. And what we see when we analyze the policy frameworks, we see pathologies. It is very rare in Africa to have a country that have all the necessary and ideal policy framework that would really look something like this, where you really have not only policy instruments, policy documents, but also instruments and programs that allows you to implement that. So there are a set of guidelines that UNESCO uses when we work with our member states. And clearly the importance that again was mentioned throughout the day of linking science, technology, innovation policies to really the national and regional development agendas. And another issue, this morning we talked about indicators. It's true that we don't have very good indicators, but we also believe that indicators are not alone, they are not enough. You really need to understand, to have more information to understand better how the systems work. And the reason is because most of the indicators, and the international ones in particular, they are really linked to research funding and management. But they really don't make, they transform the national system of science, technology, and innovation almost in the black box. They don't take into consideration all the interlinks that really a true system has. And if we really want to understand and have scientific evidence to really revise and to co-design or design or redesign our systems, we need to understand, we have to open this black box and go behind the indicators that we are used to collect to really capture really what's happening. So in effect, what we started through our observatory, the GOSPIN, what we call the Global Observatory, is to look not only to the indicators, but also to the explicit set policies and implicit policies. So this observatory is trying to really have a very comprehensive understanding how the different national systems are working and how in a regional and worldwide situation these systems are interacting. So we are therefore mapping not only the indicators that are usually mapped, but really all the policies and the instruments that are linked to those policies, and going a little bit further and really also look to implicit policies that sometimes we don't look. For instance, labor policies have quite a lot of impact in the way a country develops scientifically or not. So the Global Observatory for Science Policy Instruments, the GOSPIN, it's trying really to capture this. And it's really both, in one end, we produce the country profiles, the SETI country profiles, but at the same time we are creating a platform, an interactive platform that will allow policymakers, researchers, society to look how the different countries are doing and to understand what is promoting the growth of hampering the growth of a certain country, of a certain region, by using STI policies in the correct way. The goals of this platform, in the first place, is capacity building, really training high-rank national officials to design, implement and evaluate a variety of STI policy instruments at national and regional level, a standard setting mechanism, a data collection, and then this capacity to use a web system to really working. We have been working with African institutions. We have the mandate from AMCOST telling us to work with the African Observatory of STI policies. And we are next week launching the first report of the platform, and I'm very happy that it's Botswana. And I really want to thank the government of Botswana and the department for the hard work of producing this document. It's the first SETI country profile that is done with this methodology in the world. And I'm very glad that this Africa is we also do other, well, these are the countries we are already working on the GOSPIN survey, so other countries are coming. But we do other things in capacity building for science policy. UNESCO supports the training, for instance, in the SADC region. I was just yesterday at night in the graduation ceremony for 26 officials from the different countries in SADC. And they had 9 months training on STI policies, creating this capacity. So this long-term training, it's something that we started for the first time with the SADC region, but we are hoping not only to continue in this region, but to expand to other regions in the continent. We also have our virtual campus, we call the African Virtual Campus, that's an extension of the Mediterranean Virtual Campus, that basically increases the capacities of African institutions to deliver online courses. We also do quite a lot of policy advice. These are the countries we are working with, revising, designing science policies, evaluating the impact, and trying to support the countries to have a stronger system. But at the end of the day, and as the end of my presentation, I would like to bring something that was shared, you mentioned this morning. It's all about leadership. And if in Africa, in our governments, in our institutions, in our society, we don't have really strategic and visionary leaderships, it's going to be very difficult for our continent to really have the place that we deserve in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those were 4 very good presentations. I think since we are academics, it is important to allow some discourse. We want some feedback, so I will allow between 10 and 15 minutes of feedback from you. Questions to be asked to any of the 4 people. And if you are not ready, I will start. And I think somebody should be ready to start. Since you are not, I will start rolling. The gentleman from Australia. There's some very frightening figures. 13,000 students in secondary and tertiary, responsible for, if I was not wrong, $15 billion. Now, you are not quite clear whether these people come back to Africa or they remain there. Because I know that from the Kenyan perspective, we have lost close to hundreds of doctors who are specialists, some of whom are university took to Australia to study there, from pediatrics to what have you, to physicians, and they have not come back.
And as I mentioned, I can't tell you the numbers on how many of those have returned or not. So many of those were in tertiary institutions, many were in secondary institutions as well. So of those, most of those are sponsored by their home governments or privately sponsored. I suspect the majority do return to their home country. It was also mentioned this morning that the most important things in getting people to return is having something to return to. And I think once those things are taken into consideration, not everyone's going to come back. People from Australia go overseas and they don't come back to Australia as well. But when the resources develop, so that there's something for them to come back to, they'll come back.
Who's next?
In Kenya, we believe in gender, so I'm hoping I'll get both genders asking questions. Is that represent the other gender? Or are you still, is the food still in the stomach? Yes. Identify yourself, please, and then ask. Here.
My name is. It is a challenge you can shout. I think we are not so many.
Yeah. Okay. All right. My question goes to Derek. Derek, you talked about building local capacity, or assisting to build local capacity. My question is the quality of this local capacity, and does Tanzania have a local content regulation that requires the building of local capacity so that the jobs that are created would be owned and managed by the locals?
A simple answer, Tanzania does not yet have a local content policy. They are thinking about it. I am actually not a big fan of local content policy because I do not think that is a good thing to regulate matters like that, okay? So for example, in Mtwara in southern Tanzania, when we developed the port there, we were proud of the fact that of all the money we spent, 70% went to Tanzanian registered companies. I was in Dodoma last weekend. I was having a debate with MPs there that a lot of those registered companies are not necessarily Tanzanian. And that's the problem with local content policies. And as I said to them, that is an issue for the governments to sort out with respect to the registration policies and directorships and things like that. So, you know, that is one perspective with respect to local content policy. Another thing about it, however, to give a balanced view, from a private sector perspective, we have to be a lot more proactive in capacity for development and ensuring that these things take place. So while I do not want it to be regulated, I think it is imperative that we do it, because if you don't, then there won't be a long-term sustainable relationship.
Two more questions. One must come from the opposite gender, please. See another man there. But the fourth one has to be leadership. Unless you are saying you're not relevant. Can we drop one of the ladies there? For the sake of the Kenyan constitution.
Professor Mensah from Ghana, and my question goes to Professor Iwe. Yeah, you you hit the hammer right on the head, that what is lacking in Africa, in the engineering community, is manufacturing. We know that in the 60s, that was the philosophy of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and he opened a lot of manufacturing industries so that our engineers can go there and have hands-on practice. But as we talk now, all the industries have collapsed. And you are talking of establishing a manufacturing industry where your students can go and then have hands-on practical experience. What role can your institute, your university play in advising the government, at least to go back and look at the principles that Nkrumah had and see if we can revisit it and ensure that really we have enough manufacturing industry in the country where our engineers will have practicals. That's the question. Thank you.
Give us a quick, brief answer so that we can have the last question, and we invite the ministers to come up to the stage.
Thank you. I think we are setting an example for the government to see. So if it sees that we are doing very well financially, in fact, I want the university to be self-sustaining financially from this big industry. We are going to supply the whole of Africa with solar panels. Thank you.
So that we can.
Oh, thank God. Thank God.
Thank you, Chairman. You're really true. Now, I would like to ask this question to Professor Lydia. We talked at the end about STI training for 9 months. Can you say a little bit more about it? What kind of students? What does it involve? So that we can pass it along. You know, we have something for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
In fact, your country is already contacting us to see if we could organize something like that for federal and state level. So basically, this was a decision of ministers of the SADC region to really guarantee that their high officials would have a common training program on science, technology, and innovation policies to help not only to have the critical mass at national level, but also at the regional level, allowing therefore more capacity of the region to really promote science, technology, and innovation for sustainable development. So in a partnership with the Department of Science and Technology of South Africa, that was the responsible, let's say, ministry in the region to be the partner with the SADC Secretariat, with UNESCO, and with Australian aid, we start talking what kind of training could be done. And then we found 2 universities, the Manchester Business School and then the University of Zimbabwe, that really prepared these 9 months courses. And it constituted in presential contacts 3 workshops where all the 26 students would come together with professors and experts on science policy in Africa. And then mentoring through emails and Skype and etc. They also had to choose in their ministries something that they had to solve, and that was their practical work. So they had to produce a project and a report and a documentation that had to be good enough to be accepted as a theoretical work too. So it was not just practical but also theoretical. And I have to say that we are very happy that we lost only 3 out of 29, we lost 3 high officials. 26 graduated yesterday, and all of them have now something to implement in their own ministries or departments of science and technology. We are negotiating now the possibility to do a second cohort for SADC, But as I said, your country, your minister has already contacted us to see if we can do at the national level, federal and state. And also we had some other regions in Africa that are interested in doing something like that. I have to say that this is a very good complement to the more short-term capacity buildings that we usually carry on. Because it does give this long distance and creates these very strong networks between ministries of science and technology in the region.
Thank you. As I call the ministers to the table, you wanted to say something? The minister wanted to add something to what was said here. I'll give you 1 minute. Then the other ministers can start.
I accept this type that usually ministers are not restricted in their platforms. Anyway, I just want to add on the manufacturing, basically, Professor just mentioned. It is all about the government's determination to lead technological transfer and building technological capability. Knowledge for manufacturing a product. It starts with assembly. That is how we start learning by doing things. If we fail to do that, we are not learning anything. We pack a fridge, for example, then plug it in, then drink cold water, we are learning nothing. So in most households, appliances, medical appliances, and machineries, the government who are allocating foreign currencies to import these things must be able to guide the importers to actually something that we are going to learn something by manufacturing. A manufacturing starts from assembly. Then you can easily proceed with it. So as the professor says, the university is setting an example that the government must follow in leading technological transfer and technological capabilities of the equipment.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Are there any ministers senior from Botswana come to the table here? Yes, you can come to the table. Professor Hilary Inyang, come and take over. So my most humble self here. Dr. Sidu from Mauritius, is he here? Please come. Are there some other ministerial representatives from anywhere in this hall? There is nobody. I want to thank you very much for the cooperation I received from you when I was chair. I want to hand over to the current chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you to organize ourselves. I'll just take 2 minutes so that we can find out who's on the panel. Yes.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Makoha for making us save a lot of time. At least we are advancing to getting the time. On the table here, I would like the individual ministers or ministers' representatives to introduce themselves. So we start with Dr. Sadu.
Is it just introduction, right? My name is Arjun Sadu from Mauritius, small island of the Madagascar Indian Ocean. I am actually representing the ministry, but my real full-time job is the Executive Director of the Mauritius Research Council, which is the main research funding agency on the island. And we also are the advisor to government on all matters pertaining to science and technology.
I think I have introduced myself by just taking the stance.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kopotso Ramoroka. I work for the Ministry of Education and Skills Development here in Botswana as a Deputy Permanent Secretary responsible for support services. In that portfolio, there is the element of teacher education training or teacher education sponsorships, including teacher training as well.
Yes, my name is Hilary Nyan. I'm Vice Chancellor of the Botswana University of Science and Technology in Palape, Botswana. Let me, on behalf of the panel, thank the organizers of this event. The host, that is the University of Botswana, headed by the Vice Chancellor, Professor Fako, and of course the chairman of this symposium, as well as the planning committee. How we will proceed is this. We will allow each of the panelists to give their opening remarks and put their position statements to you. And then that will be for 5 minutes each. And after that, you'll be allowed to ask questions. I may add my own views as well. Then you'll be allowed to ask questions, and that will last for about 30 minutes. So all in all, we will have about 20 minutes of presentations and 30 minutes of question and answer. That should be very interactive. You can also give comments. So without much ado, please, we will start with Dr. Selim, who is representing Mauritius. That's all the way to the left. Yes. Please, you can use the stage here if you have some materials to present on the screen. Or you can also talk without presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair. Actually, I do know about 53 slides, so I'd rather not show anything at all, but rather talk about my own personal experience. What I would like to share with you is my view. These are probably my own personal views about innovation. I used to work for a company based in UK, and that is the Rolls-Royce aerospace industry. I've spent many years there before actually returning back to the small island Mauritius. And in both cases, in UK and in Mauritius, I've been involved in what we call the business of innovation. Part of my job in Mauritius as the head of the Executive Research Council is that every year we need to go and literally beg for funding for science and technology as well, and research. And what I've learned is that the moment you start talking about getting money for science within technology, then the ministers of whom I represent, and many other ministers, they don't want to hear that. On the other hand, they are much prepared to hear about innovation. Yes, they would like countries to innovate. So we've changed our strategy in Mauritius. We do not talk really about science and technology, but we start the conversation or the discussion with innovation. Let us innovate. And then, by the way, in order to innovate, we also need science and technology. We find that this formula seems to work because people, they tend to relate innovation with creation of jobs and creation of wealth, which is what many countries would like to achieve. So on the basis of that, what is innovation? And more so, what is innovation within the context of a small island state, which is probably different to a lot of the bigger African countries? Where I come from, the sea that belongs to the island, if you put it together, they say, and I think it's true, we know it's true, it's more than a third of the size of Europe. That is the ocean that belongs to a small island. And I've been listening a lot of how, from this morning's discussion, how can one promote innovation from to the bottom up and also top down. And I think in practice we need both strategies. We need to use policies, I totally agree. We need to use the law. For example, 5 years ago, we passed the law that mathematics and science should be compulsory in schools till the age of 16. And we are now seeing the results. Although, still, only about 30% of the students will actually do science at schools. But the top-down approach, and I like the presentation that was made in Tanzania with the discovery of gas, and I think that these are wonderful opportunities to use the top-down approach, to say to us, look, this is an emerging new sector, how can we take that sector and enhance the course of science and technology while using science and technology to also enhance the sector. So it's a win-win situation. Back at home, our equivalent of the discovery of gas is to realize the potential of the ocean. In the ocean that belongs to the small island, we've done the calculations, we believe there's every bit of energy to power the small island almost forever, in its wind, in its sea, and in its sun, of course. Of course, this is theoretical. I think innovation in the context of a small island could be how do we transform this theoretical potential into practical realities. And I think when we explain this concept to the young people, then they see a role for science and technology. As is, and for many reasons which I'm not going to go into, the teaching of science and maths and even technology are very abstract. The young people don't see it. They cannot relate it to the realities. And I think sometimes we also to follow very blindly what Mr. Cambridge would tell us as to what we need to teach our kids with regard to science and technology. I think I've been told that I've said too much already. So my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, is that science and technology, yes, they are necessary, but not sufficient for innovation. Because at the end of the day, it is not the science nor the technology that do the innovation, it is people. And to me, people means collaboration, it means teamwork, it means sharing of information, and of course, sharing the benefits as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Dr. Gas from Ethiopia.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to make a few remarks on what I have said myself this morning. And it is, we are talking about technology transfer, basically what we are exactly saying. This is a technology product. This mobile has been created by knowledge. When our policy says learn foreign technology, means we have to learn the knowledge that created this product. And from where we start from agriculture. We have to manufacture the knowledge from manufacture. We start from us, and then we move on by learning what we do. This is one thing that's going to add. Another thing we are asking our researching institutions particularly, one big question. We are asking them, who is waiting for your research output? Otherwise it will end up in a shelf. That's why we try to create university in this language. Universities assess the problem, and then the industries is waiting for that research output. If we can create such kind of cooperation and synergy, then we can be going on the right track. So I think this is goes for everybody. It's an important question, who is waiting for the research output? We have no restriction if any researcher, any scholar want to do any research in any aspect. We have no problem, except the government is not going to fund it. But if you find this for knowledge, research can go on. The sky is the limit. But when we come to the practical application of science and technology, we want the researchers should identify who is waiting for the research output. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gas. The next person will be Dr. Moroka of the Botswana Ministry of Education and Skills.
Thank you very much, Prof. the perspective of the Ministry of Education here in Botswana, I would say, as trainers or as teachers, we have a big challenge that we have to meet in this country, because our universities have been saying the product that we give and the input, because the students that come from the secondary schools are the input for the universities. They've been saying, are they really ready for university education? Are they capacitated enough to handle science and technology at tertiary level? And this is the big challenge that we have, to ensure that things like ICT are introduced quite early on in the schools. And when I say ICTs, I'm not just talking about the computer or information technology. We are talking about different aspects of ICT. And we are saying the earlier we introduce this in the schools, the better, so that the children can actually learn to manipulate these things. They can learn to work with these things before they even get to the higher level. And we believe this is the way that it can actually help children to achieve at a higher level. So this is the task that we have at hand. And we are saying it's not just about the students also handling ICTs, it's also about the teachers themselves being able to use methodologies that can incorporate ICT. And we are saying by doing this, we will train our children at a young age to be able to handle science and technology. And therefore, one of the things that we are doing currently is to ensure that we actually partner with institutions and organizations that can help us to demystify mathematics and science at an earlier age. This is a huge task for us, and we are glad that some institutions have come up to say, yes, we want to play a role to demystify mathematics and science, and to encourage the girl child to take up mathematics and science at an early age. And in fact, when we started BUST in this country, and people were saying, if you can't provide enough students for University of Botswana, where are you going to get the students for BUST? And this is what has presented a big challenge to us, to say, much as you want to internationalize education here, but you also say the local market should be ready for that. So this is where we are now as a country, and this is what we are dealing with now. That is why we have several projects that are trying to train our teachers, train our students to use ICTs. Now, as a ministry or as government, we are saying we want to feel the influence of academia in research, or should I say in the national agenda. We want to see academia be influential in the decisions that are taken by government through that research. And we are saying, through the Innovation Hub, which my colleague presented on this morning, through the different hubs that we have, we are expecting academia to be able to get into research and be able to influence the decisions that are taken by government. And we believe that the formation of the Human Resource Development Council in this country should also lend itself as a big opportunity for us to turn around funding for students, funding for institutions, funding for research. And this is where we think we can, something that we can leverage on as a country, and we need to work towards that, so that we can leverage on this organization. It has just been set up, let me put it that way. It's just been set up, and it's a very, very big opportunity. And in the last minute, we mentioned that we are presenting a challenge as a ministry to say, all institutions, not just local, even international, let's see what we can do together to bring up the children at an earlier age to the level where they can actually now be ready to do maths, science, technology, and engineering. Previously, we have sent students abroad to go and study engineering. We have a lot of students who are studying locally at BUST and the UB to do engineering, but we are saying, let's make sure that the engineering that we do is actually relevant to what industry wants. And the last person, chairperson, who should influence who here? Is it industry or the academia, who is supposed to influence who. As government, we want to make decisions, but these two groups have to help us make decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll just add a few points to what my colleagues on the table have said. At the personal level, I just recall that there are so many of these meetings at the continental level about how to improve science and technology in Africa and how to make those feature into national development plans. But at the end, every country wants to devise systems for extracting the intellect of their people for national development. How can that happen when you don't have enough sources of funding for research? If one looks at the European countries, each country has a national research foundation that funds research. And on top of that, there is the superposition of the European Science Agency that provides additional resources for that. In the United States, there's a National Science Foundation. And while a lot of countries elsewhere do have that too in Asia, but in Africa, that is very difficult. There is no continuous source of funding for research. But how can these countries develop the intellect of their people, extract that for national development? So for long, we have been advocating the evolution of the creation of an African Continental Research Foundation, because some of these countries can do well and do that on their own, like South Africa, and Botswana will soon follow. Mauritius has something like that. But there are many other African countries that cannot afford that. So perhaps that can be done on a pooled manner at the continental level. This is something that ministers of science and technology, education, national development in these countries should do. Second, many countries and many academicians in various countries complain that education, science and technology are not given the priority that they deserve. In Botswana, I think I stand to be corrected, as much as 20% of the national budget is devoted to education. But that's not the case in many African countries. So to do well there,